next section in this chapter talks about post-traumatic growth through psychodrama. So post-traumatic growth is the phenomenon of growing in the aftermath of trauma. Post-traumatic growth is not a new idea. It's been around for centuries, really. And you can find examples of post-traumatic growth in any legend or myth or religious history. But it's only been the last couple decades that psychologists and mental health professionals have been studying post-traumatic growth. Some of the research on post-traumatic growth is quite interesting and very optimistic and hopeful. In the research, they find that 1 out of 4 adults that experience trauma are going to develop post-traumatic stress disorder, whereas 2 out of 3 adults that experience trauma report growing from the trauma in some way. So that means you're significantly more likely to grow in the aftermath of trauma than you are to develop PTSD, which is very hopeful. It's important to note at the same time that in the aftermath of trauma, it's not abnormal to experience both some aspects of PTSD and some aspects of post-traumatic growth. That would be pretty normal. Although they seem to be inversely related, they also can exist at the same time. After thousands and thousands and thousands of surveys and interviews with trauma survivors from around the world, the post-traumatic growth researchers identified 5 common areas of post-traumatic growth that trauma survivors tend to report growing in the aftermath of trauma. So I'm going to go through these 5 areas briefly, and they're not in any specific order. So the first is about new possibilities in life. So in the aftermath of trauma, although trauma might flip our world upside down and close some doors and opportunities, it also opens other doors. And trauma survivors often report experiencing or finding new possibilities in life in the aftermath of trauma. Simple example is that someone who experienced trauma might come to realize that they can use their experience to help somebody else, and that was not a possibility for them prior to that experience. Second area is about an increased awareness of personal strength, that trauma really challenges us to muster up all of our strengths, our courage, our resilience, our stability and groundedness and empathy and understanding and grace. And in the aftermath of trauma, we might come to realize that we're much stronger than we thought we were. That if I could survive that horrible thing I went through, man, I could probably survive anything that life throws at me going forward. The third area of post-traumatic growth is about increased relationships with others. So in the aftermath of trauma, naturally, we're going to look to the people closest to us, the safe and helpful people in our life, to support us, to help us ground ourselves and regulate ourselves and make sense of our experience. And we might come to develop a stronger relationship with them. We might experience trauma in the context of a relationship. And in doing so, we might restructure our priorities about who are the people most important to us, who are the people we want to invest our time in. And we might develop an enhanced relationship or a sense of relationships or importance of relationships as a direct result of the trauma. The fourth area of post-traumatic growth is a stronger appreciation of life. So trauma often by its nature is something that threatens our life or the life of someone we care about. Oftentimes through trauma, we come face to face with death. And in doing so, we often can develop a greater appreciation or gratitude for life, or come to realize just how short, how fragile life can be. That the deeper our experience of sorrow and tragedy is, oftentimes the deeper our experience of joy and gratitude can be too. And the fifth area of post-traumatic growth is an enhanced sense of spirituality or religious change. That because trauma so often happens because of other human beings, we might look beyond human beings for inspiration, support, or guidance in the aftermath of trauma. We might turn to our religious beliefs. We might turn to God or spirituality or other existential practices to try to make sense of the trauma, to heal from it, and to grow from it. So these are the 5 areas of post-traumatic growth: a new sense of possibility in life, increased personal strengths, enhanced relationships, stronger appreciation for life, and a deepened spiritual or religious experience. And I want to emphasize that these are also the same 5 areas of vicarious post-traumatic growth. So vicarious post-traumatic growth is the opposite of vicarious trauma. So vicarious trauma describes the experience of being traumatized by hearing or learning about somebody else's trauma. Oftentimes, mental health professionals or medical professionals or first responders experience vicarious trauma through their work. And I want to highlight that the same professionals that work with trauma survivors and are at risk of vicarious trauma also might experience the benefits of vicarious post-traumatic growth. That as professionals, we can also grow personally and professionally through our work with trauma survivors and through seeing trauma survivors grow as a result of their trauma. It's not uncommon for professionals, including myself, to feel inspired or impressed or just really amazed by the courage, the growth, the character of the clients that we work with and the ways that they face their trauma and heal from their trauma, grow from it. And it can help us as professionals, because we're human too, it can help us grow in our own life, not just professionally, but also in our personal life. And we'll talk more about vicarious trauma and vicarious post-traumatic growth in chapter 11 of my book. So, psychodrama is unique in its capacity to cultivate post-traumatic growth in action. Rather than just talking about post-traumatic growth, we can explore and interface with the different areas of post-traumatic growth through sociometry, through role-playing, through sociodrama, through empty chair work, in action. In the research on psychodrama, in a study I published in 2022, we found that there was a positive relationship, a correlation, between spontaneity and post-traumatic growth in participants of a 3-day psychodrama workshop. That as their spontaneity increased, so too did their post-traumatic growth levels. So remember from the video on chapter 2, spontaneity is considered the curative agent in psychodrama. It's really the most important aspect of psychodrama enactments and psychodrama theory and philosophy. And we define spontaneity as this life force energy that occupies us and allows us to have adequate responses to new situations and new responses to old reoccurring situations. And so through spontaneity theory, we would conceptualize trauma, or PTSD rather, as a deficiency of spontaneity, that we're stuck in the trauma, or pathological spontaneity, in that there's a sense of chaos that's characterized by PTSD symptoms. And that somewhere in between this deficiency of spontaneity and this pathological spontaneity, somewhere between this rigidity and this chaos, is mental health and healthy spontaneity. So in psychodrama, trauma-focused psychodrama, we would try to help our clients warm up to and tap into their spontaneity so they could develop new responses to their PTSD symptoms and the way the trauma has been internalized within, so that they could cultivate a sense of trauma recovery and post-traumatic growth for themselves. Some of the other research on post-traumatic growth even shows that creativity and creative self-efficacy seems to be a key mediator for participants who grow in the aftermath of trauma. And remember from the previous video that spontaneity and creativity are twin concepts. They go hand in hand. Whenever spontaneity emerges, creativity finds its way to the spontaneity. So these research findings tend to highlight the connection between spontaneity and creativity theory and post-traumatic growth, suggesting that psychodrama could be a really effective treatment for PTSD and an avenue for helping participants cultivate post-traumatic growth in their trauma recovery. In my work with trauma, one of the things I like to do is provide some psychoeducation about post-traumatic growth and those 5 areas I outlined, and suggest to my clients that these 5 areas of post-traumatic growth can be a template for them in conceptualizing and envisioning what trauma recovery could look like for them. That in cultivating a vision of themselves in the future in recovery from trauma, they can use these 5 areas of post-traumatic growth as a sort of scaffolding for imagining what it would look like to heal and to grow from trauma, to no longer be impacted by trauma in the same way, but to turn that PTSD into post-traumatic growth. So I want to pause here for a moment, and I want to encourage you to reflect on which of these 5 domains of post-traumatic growth do you notice the most in the clients that you work with? Which of these areas of post-traumatic growth do you feel like you do the best job cultivating in your work with clients? And which of these areas of post-traumatic growth do you think you could focus more on, perhaps you've been overlooking in your work with trauma? Furthermore, I want to challenge you, if you're a professional, to consider how your work with trauma survivors has challenged you to grow or inspired you to grow, both as a professional and as a human being working with trauma. Has your work in the field helped you see new possibilities in your own life? Has it helped you find and tap into your own personal strengths as an individual? Has it helped you cultivate deeper relationships in your personal life? Has it given you a stronger appreciation for life? And has it helped you recommit or develop a stronger commitment to spiritual or religious practices? So how has your work with trauma survivors inspired you to grow?